So the last thing that you said was, how do you know when you've completed all of the possible permutations of chord progressions and shapes slash positions? I noticed that the C shape was missing from some of the provided examples. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So from here, this will let us kind of like work backwards to some of the kind of more like applied, like foundational things that you were asking. So basically, I mean, C shapes are great, G shapes are great. All of that stuff is really great. I started to teach this to people because I was realizing that some of my students, I have a bunch of, or I have a fair number of students who have like done a lot of musical stuff that's like pretty legit. Like they've like played in bands that are like in some cases like very well known, but they only know enough guitar to play the parts that they play in the band. And they kind of just like joined a band when they were in college or something, and it just kind of kept going. And so they're like, I feel like I'm not a real guitarist. And like they kind of are because they're like going on stage and stuff, but they're also like, I don't know what the names of these notes are. Like, I don't know what this chord is called, even though I play it all the time. I don't know what this chord is called, even though I play it all the time, you know? And so this was a way to kind of like try to kind of fill in that gap. So basically, this is kind of like making sure that people know about this stuff. It would be good to be very thorough. Before I talk about why I didn't get into C and G shapes in this module, I'll just kind of like my mind. I'm maybe more caffeinated than I should be at 6:30 p.m. So my mind is going like two topics ahead, but I'm gonna
But glad
not
we're in
do
the
that.
same boat.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Everybody's very awake. Okay, so basically, the point of this training that you're working through is just to show that if you know basically the same shape on three different string sets, and I'll explain why it's the same shape in a second, which is this, and this, then you can play a ton of chord progressions. I mean, those are all major chord voicings, but you can play, basically you can play a ton of chord progressions in a bunch of different places on the fretboard. And I was realizing that there were some students, like this is a skill that I kind of took for granted. I think because of some of my early learning music experiences where I would just like play music. I'd just like jam with friends and I'd figure this out and we'd play like two chords for like half an hour or something because we liked to do that. It wasn't even really jamming. It was just us trying to figure out how things worked, I think. But so I was able to kind of figure this out early because after a while you get bored with the same chord progressions and stuff. But I realized a lot of people didn't have that. So the idea is basically like, let's say that you can play A, D, and E. And some people, and then back to A, just that we have 1, 4, 5, 1. Like some people will really only know it in that position, or they'll know that you can do this. But when it comes to start thinking across string sets and stuff, it's like really difficult for them. And so this was just like using just basically this one shape, which shows up on these three different string sets in these three different ways. Here's how you can do all this stuff. And so that was more the goal for that section. So it might actually be a little bit lower level than a lot of the stuff that you're thinking about with chords. And it's also cool that you're here and you're asking about it because we can go way deeper. But that was kind of the beginning point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that actually that fills in something that I completely missed, which is that essentially these are all the same chord uh, voicing, just in slightly different shapes based on which string sets they're on.
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't recognize that when I was going through it.
Right. It's really funny. Okay, and then this relates to one of the sort of lower level and also sort of higher level questions that you were asking. It's kind of both at the same time, and so I'll get to that after this. But yeah, these are basically the same shape. They're different shapes for our fingers, but in terms of how the pitch is configured, it's basically the same chord, which is that it's
Harmonic
basically
feelings.
one, yeah, it's 1, 5, octave, third, fifth, and then sometimes one after that.
Yeah,
You know, and
this gets to maybe the other thing that I was talking about, which is how do you represent this? And I was literally, I didn't make it out yet, but I was literally about to go down to like the art supplies shop and get a bunch of colored pencils so I could draw on the like scale degrees.
yeah, yeah,
And if I did that, that relationship would jump out, and I'd
yeah,
be
yeah.
like, oh, okay. But I just haven't done that work yet because I'm
Totally. Yeah, that gets to the next thing that you were asking about, which is a really cool question, and I want to ask about it. Um, yeah. Okay. So I just want to just for the sake of the recording and also just for your own edification, make sure that we're super clear on this. So this gets called an A shape. This gets called a D shape. This gets called an E shape, right? But they're really all, in terms of like interval structure, basically the same, except that they have different numbers of strings on top. So in the E shape, you have 1, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1. And then, in the A shape, it's all the same thing, except that there's one less string at the top, so it only goes up to the fifth. And then the D shape, it only goes up to the major third. And so people think about those as being different shapes, but really, in terms of interval structure, they're the same. At this point, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but yeah. And so that relates to this other question, which is like that you have, which is like getting away from just like thinking about notes as like black dots drawn on a grid, where they're all kind of the same, and emphasizing the different personalities of every note, being able to visualize the different personalities of every note, which is really important. Before I get to that, I just want to briefly mention the G shape and the C shape and like why those didn't make it into this. So for one thing, these shapes, the C shape's really well known. Like, obviously for C chord, you move it up 2 frets, you have your D chord, right? Or do you know about this one?
I would say that is the most commonly played chord that I use because
Nice.
it's in drop D. It's a
Oh
lot,
yeah.
lot of fiddle tunes in D. So
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. I think I jumped to these because they're just they're more basic. Like they're more widely used in like pop music and stuff. And like, so many people have like heard Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones. That I can be like, oh, it's these chords, and then they're using those chords. So that like gets people started. But yeah, so the other thing about this shape is that it's actually literally a different like interval structure, in that it's like a closed position triad. And by closed position, I just mean all the notes are as close together as they can be. So after the 1, we have the 3rd, and after the 3rd, we have the 5th, and after the 5th, we have the octave, and after the octave, we have the 3rd. It's like a piano chord. It's like we're playing it on a piano and we're not doing some crazy stretch, So it is also just kind of a different chord shape. And then also like the G shape, I don't really use the high E string when I play this shape, but I'll use that all the time. Or just that, just play the triad. Or just the triad and the octave. That's a really nice one. And that's also kind of like closed position. So that's like 1, 3, 5, 1. Yeah, okay, so basically the reason I didn't get into those is because my goal with this section was just to like, one, make sure that people have some super foundational things covered. And then two, and this is also going to apply to like this section about triads, as you get into the triads and stuff. Different people are, coming at this from different skill levels. And I was more interested in giving people some things that they could start to actively work with and discover and have some agency with than I was interested in trying to give them like an encyclopedia. But at the same time, that's really what the calls are for. And we can go way deeper into things. Yeah. And so that's kind of why the C and G shapes were not there. Does that make sense?
yeah. And I think me asking about it was maybe looking forward a bit because the last time I really like sat down and tried to learn new chords, I was trying to go through some like Django jazz type stuff.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I was trying to read a chart, and it's like it took me like an hour just to figure out 3 different chords because I'm like, okay, I know these from theory,
Oh, yeah.
but I don't know the commonly used shapes. And
Oh,
so I have
yeah.
to figure out not just like all the possible permutations of putting these notes together, but then the ones that my fingers can reach, and then the ones that just sound right idiomatically. And it was just impossible because uh, I don't know, gave up before I could finish.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so once we start adding seventh chords and tensions and all of that, like how do I know that I've gotten them all, I guess is
Right.
the inherent question.
Right. Okay. And that's definitely a much bigger question. Um, but yeah, I mean, I have so much to say about that. Just really quick with Django chords. I mean, the really classic, minor swing. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I can show you what those were if you want. I was like a diehard Django fan when I was like 21, 22. I transcribed like a ton of his stuff. So I'm super,
Nice.
yeah, yeah. So I'm, yeah, super into Django. Okay. So, before getting into this question about like becoming a chord encyclopedia, basically, nice. Kirsten's also into Django. Awesome. We got a room full of Django fans here, which is great. It's the best. Yeah, people, side comment, like when I was doing like this like Facebook group in the fall and trying to find students that way, and the people that I get to work with through this program, like y'all are so great. Like, and just the level of discourse here, it just feels higher than in the Facebook group where it's a lot of just angry people on Facebook who have a lot of opinions about things that they're not really studying. So I don't mean to talk down about the Facebook group, but this is just like, oh my God, this is much better. So, okay. So, let's talk about your other question now. Okay. So I'll just, I'll read it off so that you've got, so that, yeah, Kirsten can be brought up to date. Okay. So, some concerns about the major bar chords fretboard discovery exercise. The first one is, you don't really use pencils, and doing this in pen, if you make a mistake, then you're going to have a mistake that's written in pen on a piece of paper. And so then that's just like confusing and not ideal. And then the other option is, doing things with like, like graphic editors on like a computer, or using, like a graph notebook. And so, oh yeah, the kind of, and then something about the chord charts that I showed in the PDF, which is font weights. Oh yeah. Okay. So first off, just let's just talk about this before we get into like colored ink and stuff that could be really cool. Okay. So, I think first what we're talking about is just internalizing information.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, um, something that can be useful, that's been very useful for me when I was learning a lot of chord voicings and stuff, basically was using writing, writing things out, like in my case, like in a notebook, as a way to structure my thoughts. And then I would practice it on the guitar, but there is this sort of thinking stage before I'd start to process it. And the fact that I was figuring them out for myself and writing them all out gave me a different relationship to them than if somebody just like drops a PDF or drops like a printout of something in front of me and is like learn these, you know. And
Yeah.
so, also side note, I'd love to hire a graphic designer at some point to make that write up look nicer. Right now, that's out a little bit. It's not the highest priority for what I'm doing with the course, but that is something that I'd like to do at some point. Um, okay, so basically, however you choose to make however you choose to represent something, I think that it's really useful for somebody who's learning chord voicings to write them out for themselves. Um, and so whether it's with colored ink or whether it's just with like one color of ink, um, that's the next thing I want to talk about. But yeah, basically, whether you're writing it out on a computer or whether you're writing it out by hand, I think it is really useful to get a little bit into the sauce of just like writing out all the chords and being like, wait, I could also do it like this. And then you start to find all these cool things. Like I was running into all these interesting challenges actually when I was trying to do it, which is like, how do I organize these? I could write them all ascending and descending. Like I could, if it's just A, E, D, I could go, or, A, D, E, uh, like I could do it that way. I could try to just focus by fret, by region of the fretboard, but then at a certain point, I'm going to need to decide to drop down so that I can go back up to the start point and stuff. And that's really cool because as I was trying to figure out how I was going to represent this to other people, I started to see so many possibilities that it actually got a little bit, maybe not overwhelming, but I was like, there was a point where I was like, I need to like pull this back a little bit and just like restrict it so that I'm not just writing chord shapes forever. So Kirsten asks writing them on a music sheet. Like, yeah, totally. That's a great way to do it. And so basically, whether we're using tabs or whether we're using chord symbols or whatever, like I think this is one case where actually there is a really quick solution to this, which is that like you can write things there's paper that you can get where there's like for example like tab and then there's also like sheet music and they're like or like staff notation and they're like attached to
Yeah.
each other. So yeah, and so for me, That actually probably would have been a really good exercise. Yeah, Kirsten was saying so chord diagram or write the notes. Yeah, all of these options work. And so Kirsten, just to bring you up to speed, like Daniel is trying to kind of thinking about what the best way would be to go through representing these and writing these out. Um, yeah, so I guess for me the purpose of chord symbols and the purpose of tabs, and I think your suspicion towards all of that stuff is pretty well founded because you're trying to really understand what all the notes are for, and all those things bring us back to the grid, and the grid is not musical, and the grid is like has no opinions about anything and doesn't teach you anything about music. The grid is a little bit like a wasteland. Um, but it's like we kind of pass through the grid, right? With intention and with knowledge so that we can apply things very directly. And I think that's where the colored ink starts to come in.
Yeah.
And so I think all of this is like, um, building your own map of voicings on the guitar, and that's why I'm asking people to actively go through this for themselves instead of memorizing something. Because if it's just like them memorizing something instead of figuring it out, then they're going to need to figure it out on the fly at some point, and it's going to be confusing. So I might as well have people try to do this way. Okay, so let's say that you're trying to write down. Well, actually, before we get into the colored ink and stuff, does this make sense so far?
It does. And I think the frustration that I got to when trying to like think about all this stuff is really just evidence of things that I've discovered that have not worked for me, and
Hmm.
already in the question, like solutions are starting to present themselves.
Cool. I'm glad to hear it. Um, okay. So yeah, so then here's a place where colored ink can show up. So with all of these chords, we've only got three types of notes, which are one, three, and five. And um, something that could be a really good exercise, and there's another way. So okay, I'm going to present you two ways to do this. One, oh yeah, Christian is saying it's a good idea to know the notes in the chord. Absolutely. And so what we're talking about is like, because Daniel is very reasonably suspicious of just thinking about being like, oh, and then I put my fingers here and it does this, and he wants to know the names of the notes, the functions of the notes, the personality of the notes, like what's actually going on from like a sound perspective. It's like, how can we write these chord symbols down, or these specific chord voicings down in a specific place on the fretboard without going back into just like the world of like dumb tabs, where it tells you nothing about the musical content. So one idea with the colored ink thing that I like, would be, like let's say that you got three colors of pencil, like, and I don't know, I'll let you choose your own colors, but you say this color is one, this color is three, and this color is five. Then if you're writing out this chord progression and you're writing out, let's say that you have two chords in the sequence that you're writing that are the same shape, but they start on different frets. If for whatever reason you're writing A and then B, then you'll actually go through the process twice of being like, what's happening on the low E string? Blue pencil, that's one. Like orange pencil, that's five. And then blue pencil, oh, that's one again. And so what it makes you do is just think about it and get clear about it. And every time that you go through that process of thinking about it and getting clear about it, whether you're playing it or counting it out or singing it or writing it down, all of it goes to reinforce this memory thing that you're building, which is just like immediate knowledge of how those notes relate to each other. And so I think colored ink could be a really great way to do that, actually, if that's something that you're interested in.
Yeah, I think I thought it was kind of just a silly thing that I came up with at first, but now I think I'm really committed to this idea because well, yeah, there are a couple problems that I wanted to solve. One of them was like just knowing the like scale degree or chord degree or whatever you want to call it of each note within a chord. But I think also I'm just thinking of all of the things that I've realized about chord like standard chord chart things that are just like I need to do this better for me. Um, the other one is it's basically going through every time there's like a symmetry which maybe obscures something. So even the fact that like some like chord charts, let's say like is on the seventh fret. Well, that means you need to like write a seven next to it and be like, okay, this is where this actually means. But it at a glance, it's going to look like a very different chord that's in the open position other than that seven or whatever. So I think when I go through this, I'm probably actually going to print out like a full fretboard for each chord. That way I can see like write it out and be like, okay, that's where it is. It's unique, and that uniqueness is represented at the expense of a little bit of wasted ink, let's say. But I think that's kind of the level that I want to get to with this is I don't know. Like I think a lot about um information theory, I guess, or like
Yeah, yeah,
information architecture, you might say. And like I'm a programmer and maybe a little bit OCD, or we'll just say particular.
yeah.
Um, and also I find finding relationships between these things interesting. And I think like deviating from the way that this has just like been done and overdone to death, but in a very basic form, I think is going to open up some possibilities and might,
Absolutely.
just discover some ways of learning this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, just in relation to the last thing that you said, like anytime that something is feeling stale and stuck and limiting, I feel like anytime that it relates to any part of the musical process, it could be about if you're writing a song, feeling stuck with a form, feeling stuck with a sound. At one point, I felt very stuck with the guitar because I wanted sounds that would sustain or would get louder or would sustain and then transform. You know, all these things you really can't do with the guitar. When something starts to feel like a limitation, finding a way to sort of dramatically open the aperture in this case, it's like, okay, there are all these little tiny chord symbols. I feel boxed in by those. I'm gonna write it on the like a printout of the entire fretboard so that I can really see it. That sounds like a great exercise. And I think just in general, a really useful creative strategy can be like if you're feeling boxed in by something, actively take note that you are feeling boxed in by it, and then figure out how to like zoom way out. That's kind of just like a I don't know. I'm like writing every morning right now, and so I'm thinking about. I think I'm translating things into that. One other just kind of cool observation is that you are you're a programmer, and actually one of my most important composition teachers, maybe my most important composition teacher, was a computer programmer for a long time and was like very successful in it before he went to grad school for composition when he was like 35. And he actually was one of the first people who started to talk to me about the idea of colored ink. He was using it like in a different way than you are, but I think it's just a
Yeah.
programmer thing, right? Or is this
I'm
not a
really
programmer
curious
thing?
about that. Yeah, no, I think well, just we deal with representation of information
Yeah.
and that what is music if not that in some sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. Well, just really quick for fun. Basically, one of the things that he recommended was if I'm writing music that I'm not feeling 100% about, or if I'm engraving something, like meaning making a score, typing it into a computer program that I'm not feeling 100% about, and I don't want to feel boxed in by a section when I'm looking at it that I know isn't done, but there are things on either side of it that are done. He recommended just turning the whole thing into colored ink so that I could look at it and just have it visually look different than things that are done. And then a tip that he gave me that's really great is like don't make it a punitive color. Like don't make it like red. Make it something that suggests growth, like green. And I was like, that's incredible. And I still do that when I'm writing lyrics. If there's like a block of text that I'm not 100% on, I'll use green ink instead. Um, yeah, yeah. And then he does some other stuff that's more connected to like William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, which was originally supposed to be printed in all like every sentence was supposed to be in like a different color, and they were related to all these different like streams of consciousness and stuff. But then the book wound up being printed in black ink because the editors like or the publishing company just couldn't afford it. And so the book's like really hard to follow because the through line that you're supposed to have, which is like what color the ink is no longer in the book. And so that's why it's really hard to follow, which is really funny. But anyway, that's a side comment. Yeah,
I'm going
okay.
to try to find a version of this book that's written in multicolored ink. Somebody has got to have done it, and if not, I have a
It's
project ahead of
yeah,
me.
yeah. It's in the archive too, apparently the Faulkner Archive, which I think is like at whatever the school in Texas was that my mentor went to for undergrad. And he's like seen the manuscripts and stuff that were in colored ink. So
Wow.
yeah. Honestly, in another life, actually, in this life, I came very close to being a software engineer. I almost studied computer science at Oberlin, and then at one point, almost did a boot camp when I was feeling despair about my life in New York as a musician. So,
Uh-huh.
it's something that I'm very interested in. But anyway, okay. So, does this? resolve your questions about writing out chords? Is there anything that we skipped over?
I think let me double check to make sure, but I think that answers one, my frustrations, because really you just validated like that this is part of the discovery process.
Totally.
And also what you were saying about like zooming out as a strategy when feeling like that confined feeling, because that's I think that's what I was experiencing. And so
Yeah.
and yeah, and now I think I've got the path forward. So
Cool.